Your next talk comes from Paula Kaminska. She is the UX Director of Tuesday, a fintech startup based in Liskeard in Cornwall. In this session, she's going to be diving into how a great user experience is no longer a nice-to-have thing for any successful business, but is indeed a necessity. I'm sure this is going to be packed full of useful content that you can take and apply to your business right away. Enjoy!
Hi everyone, my name is Paula Kaminska and I'm a User Experience Director at Tuesday. Tuesday is a financial technology startup based in Cornwall, and I've been with them for nearly 3 years now, totally overseeing the entire user experience, but also employee experience, because these two are tightly linked, and today I would also like to show you how. I tried to make this presentation as approachable as possible for someone without any background. However, those who already know a lot about UX shouldn't feel discouraged at all. In the background, I have to just explain a couple of key terms just to create a nice starting point for all of us, and so that you can understand how design world has changed in the last 20 years and why great user experience plays a key role in business today. And UX does make a big difference. I will show you data about big players and how their well-implemented user experience design processes significantly improve their financial performance. And after that, I will move into a case study, and I will use Tuesday, the current company I work for, as that case study. I will show you what design assets are out there and how did we use them at Tuesday. And hopefully you can use them, or your employees can use them to champion your product or service. So to start with a bit of background, user experience design is an ever-evolving field, and I had a great opportunity to evolve together with that field. And I guess the change in the industry is very well reflected in my own experience. Because I do have over 20 years of experience in the industry, which people still ask me about because I'm still fairly young. But I did my first website when I was 12, and I got really into it. It was my massive hobby, making websites. And by the age I was 14, a few of those websites became very popular in my country, purely because there was no other website on the same subject in that language. There was no competition. And as a result of that, I had quite strong following, and quite organically, without having any knowledge, I built communities around those websites. I didn't look for any knowledge about it. I don't think there was any available anyway. I simply followed my intuition. But what I want to make you aware is how different the world was back then, in late 90s. I probably built those websites on Windows 95, maybe 98, using Notepad and writing from scratch in HTML and eventually CSS as well. Basically, the internet was ugly. The websites weren't pretty, and the concept of user experience design didn't even exist in our conscious minds. The mantra of this .com domain era was build it and they will come, because there was no competition, right? So it was just all about embracing this new medium. And so I was a webmaster, someone who would do everything related with web. Obviously, many things have changed since then. When I got into my first full-time employment, the split was very clear. You were either a web designer or a web developer, and very few people could do both things at this point professionally. But why there are so many jobs? Why the field became so complex that there is a need for so many different specialists? Well, mostly because so many businesses embrace the internet. So the standard went really up. And that also means that users, prospective users, have higher expectations trained by the experiences they had so far with other brands. It's no longer a competitive advantage, really, to have a UX designer on board, something we used to hear about a lot a few years ago. Nowadays, it's something really users demand. So that was my timeline. Now let's see what else happened. It wasn't just web industry that evolved so much. We also have a completely new industry of mobile apps. And this industry didn't exist 12 years ago. And currently, it really is dominating the planet. It's one of the largest industries on our planet at the moment. So the mantra, build it and they will come, no longer works. You can build the app, you can build your product or service, put it online, but they will not come. It's just not enough anymore. So what user experience design is doing today is addressing and solving a real problem users might have, and it should be a well-researched pain point this audience has. And it should solve it in the most smooth way possible without any extra hassle. In Tuesday, for example, we have one team to do user experience design, the actual graphic design and other medias, and marketing. One team working very closely, because it's no longer enough to have a great working product. You also have to advertise it in a way that captures users' attention. And to do that, we have something called brand's tone of voice. Maybe you've heard about that phrase. I think one of the most famous case studies online, at least I came across, was Monzo. Monzo released a really nice kind of style guide, but not for design, but tone of voice. And there's also lots of blogs about it. So I'm sure if you Google it, you will find some great examples or even links to that style guide if it's still online. Specifying how their brand should communicate with the user. And not only on social media, but also within the app. It should be one consistent experience for the user, where the brand always uses the same voice, tone of voice. And now that's tricky to do, because you have many people writing content for many different snippets. Different person will write a blog, different person usually writes an ad, and you have different specialists to write messages within the app itself. So to do that, we do need kind of style guides that can be, I guess, one point of reference for all teams how to communicate. And what's even better is when that brand communicates in the way the user does. They use similar, maybe even words or style of communication. And I think the big change happened when brands entered social media platforms. Because social media platforms, by definition, are for people to kind of communicate with each other, right? Socialize. But the moment brands enter the scene, they have to change the way they communicate. In the past, news were rather kind of in the broadcasted style. They were not driving any engagement. They were more like announcements. While nowadays, brands have to interact with people on social media the way people interact with each other, which is actually a great opportunity for those brands that are aware of how powerful a tool it actually is. And by bringing this user experience into onboarding process or even reaching out to find users, we do something called designing a behavior change. Because you see, people have their pain points, their problems, and even if your solution doesn't exist yet, they do find ways to solve their problems, because no one likes to have problems. They will always find some workaround. So the moment you create a product or service that is supposed to respond to that problem and improve the way people deal with it, well, you have to take into account people already have some ways of coping with it. And to move people away from one solution or workaround, whatever it is, to your product, hopefully better, you have to design a behavior change. top reasons why people uninstall apps. In this case, we talk about mobile apps. So 71% found notifications annoying. Now, I must add that this data, I think it's from 2017. I couldn't find newer results. So after this became an obvious problem, many companies changed their strategy and allow people modify how the notifications show on their screen. So users are no longer interrupted by push notifications that they can't switch off. For example, many apps allow to choose how and maybe even when notifications should show. Slack, for example, has a really nice option called Quiet Time, where a user can specify the time of the night, usually by default it's night, when they don't want to see any notifications, which obviously makes sense. If most people use Slack for work, no one would like to be reminded about work, I guess, in the middle of the night. And then complex registration. So people dropped out from signing up within the app if the process is too long, too complex, or requires maybe too many documents. And what's interesting that the tendency for people's tolerance is changing over the time, and it looks like in the future people will become even less forgiving for mistakes. And for brands, it's important to understand that the satisfying experiences are not momentary harm. They can create a long-term harm for many, many brands. And interestingly, if someone has a really dissatisfying experience, they will maintain a negative perception of the brand. And obviously they will be less likely to make any transaction with that brand again. And 1 out of 5 people will even tell other people, like friends or family, about their bad experience. So then you end up having people who never interacted with your brand, product, service, anything, and they already have a negative perception of it. And this data looks scary. And what's even more scary is that younger generations are even less forgiving. So to start with a nice base, I think it would be good to decode a certain buzzwords in our industry we hear all the time. We have interactions, usability, you hear about user-centered design, user experience design, which I already talked a lot about, and you have design thinking as well. And I often find people use them interchangeably as if they are synonyms, but they do stand for different things. And I think it's very important to understand those differences so that you can implement them in your company well. So for example, interaction. I hope this image is meaningful enough. Interaction doesn't happen just online. We humans interact all the time with each other, ourselves, but also with the whole reality around us. Pedestrian crossing, cars, fridges, cash machines, our mobile devices, of course, and not just apps, and food. We experience this constant ongoing interaction with various systems that are designed by different people and guided by individual rules. So it's almost like every time we learn this process a bit again. And human-computer interaction is just a small fraction of that interaction. However, I believe that to design a good product, we can't just measure and research how people interact with interfaces we design or want to design. We need to look more holistically at the entire experience. So, for example, when you do a usability test to see how people interact with your app on a mobile device, you will also see how they hold their phone, how they use their thumb or maybe different finger to press buttons on the screen. And already you can see how the use of different devices impacts how smooth their experience with the app will be. Now, user experience design is an interesting one because it's very present in the IT world today, but it's more of a psychological field. Because by definition, it includes users' accomplishments, emotions, responses, both physical and psychological, beliefs, preferences, perceptions, attitudes towards any system, any product, any service really. And this occurs before, during, and after each use. So what does it mean? That what matters for users is the product or service efficiency, friendliness, ease of use. And that's exactly what user experience design is trying to do, is to improve the satisfaction of that interaction by enhancing products' usability, accessibility, even maybe giving users some pleasure, which makes it, as I said, psychological field full of measuring and problem solving, really, because we measure how people respond to different solutions and how they could potentially be improved. User-centric design, on the other hand, or user-centered design, they are synonymous, is an iterative process, a design process which supports and enhances user experience. So here, designers focus on users and their needs, trying to get really deep understanding who they are and how they will be using that product. So I hope this diagram looks familiar to you, because by all means it should overlap with your product lifecycle process, lifecycle design and development. And I said it's iterative, so that means it doesn't happen just once. You may start with planning and do research, but next time you go through that iteration, which might be next week, some companies do those iterations on a weekly basis. So if it comes to designing a mobile app, for example, the very first week will be about sketching some paper prototype, a very quick one, just to be able to test a very early idea for a product. Next week, the decisions will be more informed, right? Because we already tested that paper prototype. We know how people responded to it and what could improve. So we can not only improve that paper prototype, but move a bit further and perhaps digitize it at this point, so that we can also test the actual interaction on the screen, especially if we make a clickable prototype. Low fidelity, obviously, to start with. And then we have usability, and Jacob Nielsen, I would call him a father of usability. He came up with 10 usability heuristics. I listed here a couple of them. Visibility of system status. What does it mean? That means timely feedback. Users want to be aware what happens with the product process they are focusing on. For example, let's say the simplest example I can think of is a page loading online, right? You are in your browser, loading a page. How will you know when the page will load if you have a slow internet because you don't really have 4G at the moment? Well, fortunately today we have this really nice progress bar, and you can see it's moving from usually 0 to 100, but just visually you have feedback. You can estimate, looking at the speed of the progress bar, when that page will eventually load. What's less intuitive is, for example, circling a refresh icon, which are quite common, but if they don't have, I don't know, percentage maybe in the middle, users will really not know when something will load. So obviously both solutions are good, but for very different contexts. Consistency and standards. Conventions are very safe. For example, think about online shops. User control and freedom. So why it's useful? Why it's important? Because internet is a little bit more abstract than our physical world. So our physical world has gravity and we have world directions. So it's quite easy to orientate ourselves. However, internet is abstract. It doesn't really have any rules. There's no sense of direction in the internet. So we have to create that sense of direction, give sense of control to people who use our products. Simple example again, because we don't have much time. Breadcrumbs were very, very popular 10, 20 years ago. Breadcrumbs basically show the full path to the user so that he or she knows where they are on the website. So if they, for example, are on the product page, breadcrumbs will usually say home, products, then the name of the category of those products, let's say stationery products, and then possibly we can have another subcategory or name of that product. And all those breadcrumbs are clickable so that user can click on any of them to move up the tree, if you like, and come back to the parent element. That creates a really nice sense of control. However, breadcrumbs are a bit outdated today. You don't really see them much around online, mostly because we improve our design methods. We can design menus so well that people who use them always know where they are on the page by, let's say, underlining the active element. But within the mobile apps, what's quite new are the undo buttons, which are quite handy. So in the past, let's stick with the example of the online shop, you would have a couple of items in your basket and you decide to remove one of them. In the past, usually you would see a dialogue, a quite patronizing one, asking you, are you sure you want to proceed? And then you click yes. So first of all, it doesn't create a nice experience because it assumes you don't know what you are doing. That's why it's asking you that question. And second, it creates extra clicks and extra cognitive load because you have to suddenly process a message which might look like a scary one. So it may change the emotional state of the user as well. So I believe that in many, many contexts today, it's good to use undo buttons so that users can delete whatever they like the moment they press on it. But then they have some time, or maybe forever, to undo that action if they realize they made a mistake. Maybe there is a dedicated bin, depending on the context. With emails, it's quite useful. It's good to have a bin and be able to retrieve those emails back. Because again, undoing the action will be less common. And then we have errors, errors prevention. If certain options are not available, it's better not to show them at all. In some contexts, it might be useful to still show them, but to make them unclickable, explaining maybe in gray color why it's not available at the moment and when it might be available again, rather than letting people choose that option and on the next screen see an error message because that option wasn't available. Hopefully that makes sense. I will move now quickly to the next one, which is design thinking. And design thinking is quite different to what we talked about so far. It's really trending at the moment, but it's really not a new concept. It might be new in the IT industry. So design thinking is a creative problem-solving approach for teams. It helps those teams come up with creative, innovative solutions. And at the same time, interestingly, creates a common ground. Teams develop shared vocabulary, shared communications. They don't argue about what they are about to build because that gets sorted out pretty quickly and they can focus on how they're gonna do it. Now, the key to design thinking workshops is to invite right people. And you might think, it's all about designers, but not necessarily. In a good design thinking workshop in a startup, we would have a designer, obviously, someone who facilitates that workshop. We would have at least one developer, someone from the tech team, telling us what's possible and what's not. We might have an intern, maybe a tester, someone from QA, and ideally someone from C-level as well. At Tuesday, we were doing quite successfully. When I joined Tuesday, I actually managed to organize a 2-day workshop, full 2 days, and I managed to bring everyone. It was a small team at the time. It was, I think, 6 of us. I managed to bring everyone, including CTO and CEO. And together we were trying to create basis for what Tuesday is about and what the products should really do. So as you see, it helps avoid unnecessary arguments, because you can imagine easily if technical people are not included in the first workshops about the product, then designers might start designing something which won't be possible with the technology we are using. So in workshops like that, actually, we might even choose what technology we'll be using, or just prioritize the features we are gonna build for the next version of the product. So there are many options for using this kind of workshops. And as a result of those workshops, designers produce many design artifacts. Depending on the workshop, it might be empathy map, which tells us how users feel and what they think, who they really are, creating good feel for them so that we can design for them and not for ourselves, which is a common tendency. We can create some prioritization matrices. We can obviously create wireframes and sketch some storyboards, create customer journey maps. Or, as I said earlier, we can just prioritize ideas, for example, which features we are gonna go for. And what's great about those artifacts is that they are quite playful, and our brains do like being playful and being creative. I mean, it helps the companies for people to be creative. So if you can create documentation from meetings that triggers people creativity and innovative thinking, that's great for that product. No one really likes reading long, boring documents with pure text. And what's more, these artifacts are easy to be amended. It's very easy to change them, update them, create a new version. What this does, this kind of workshop, it creates a trust-based team culture. People are involved from very early stages of the product or its version, and thanks to that, they are more committed, and research says it improves even retention because people are more motivated, they have higher job satisfaction, their voice is being heard from the very beginning. So it's almost a team building exercise in a way, which you can do on a daily basis and at the same time strengthen your product. What design thinking also does, it removes the hierarchies and disagreements. Because I will stereotype a little bit, but in the past, we would hear about those companies where person with the loudest voice or person who feels more in power makes decisions about product, often micromanaging. And design thinking workshops happen in silence, and everyone has the same space to express themselves. So everyone puts their ideas on post-it notes, later they get grouped, and later they're voted. And you can see tiny red dots on my slide. So basically these are voices. And everyone, regardless whether they're an intern, a developer, or someone from C-level, they have exactly the same amount of voice. So it's quite democratic decision making, which makes everyone's voice feel appreciated, which is really, really important for building a team. So we covered the basics. I know you already know that user experience design matters, otherwise you wouldn't hear my talk, you wouldn't be here today. So I'm just gonna focus how much it actually matters. So in October 2018, McKinsey did a very interesting research. Actually, they published research they were carrying on for 5 years. In these 5 years, they examined 300 different companies, different industries, and this research helped them identify design actions those companies take. And 12 of them were significant for this company's financial performance. And you can see this graph. So the gray color shows the industry benchmark, and the pink one shows companies strong at design. So those companies that were performing this particular 12 design actions. And they outperformed the industry benchmark financially by 2-1. That's quite spectacular. Now let's see what those actions were. they are grouped here into 4 categories. First category, user experience. So it's not just about the product, it's about looking more holistically at user experience, learning who our users are, how they live their lives, so what's important for them. Think about Google Pay or Apple Pay, which are apps designed to basically access cash. And those apps wouldn't be designed without a really holistic approach to users and seeing how people interact in real life and what are the struggles in real life. So those 2 products, they merge the gap between digital and physical reality. It's almost an out of the ecosystem solution. So research is important, but also user experience design should be implemented well and fully. Otherwise, it will not improve the financial performance. It has to be done well, and the real understanding of the user has to be there as well. I will show you some examples in a bit when we move on to a case study. Now, the next type of design actions for improved performance is continuous iteration, which is something you might be already familiar with from Agile. Agile is the methodology for managing projects, let's say, in short. Continuous iteration, which is something that user-centered design refers to, which we already covered, encourages learning, encourages testing, experimenting with different ideas. Because as designers, we never know what's the ideal solution we should design for our users, right? We are not them. We can design for ourselves. So we always have to make some assumptions. So basing on what we know about users, we make an assumption and create a prototype. And later we test that prototype with prospective users to verify how good it actually is or how it could be improved. So there is an element of experimenting there. Another feature of iterative processes is that they are not irreversible, right? If we change something, but later in the time we realize actually that was a bad change, we should come back to the previous version. That's absolutely fine because we do design iteratively. And sometimes certain design solutions don't work in certain contexts, and then over the time the context may change, and then different match is needed. So again, in continuous iteration, user's voice doesn't get lost, and that's really, really key. Third group is all about having cross-functional talent, so that user experience design is not just the domain of designers. And as I mentioned earlier, at Tuesday, we have one team doing design, user experience, and marketing. But not only that, I believe everyone in the company should advocate for a great user experience. Also developers, or maybe especially because they actually build the product people will be using. So there is no need to guard your ideas as designers. I think everyone should believe in the ideas designers are trying to bring to the company, or at least the values behind them, and test them to have data-driven decision making. And to do that, obviously, we need a culture of openness. We need to have shared values, and designers have to have right tools and capabilities and infrastructure to thrive. I said about decision making, and it's still very common when a manager who's not a designer picks one design from 3 available. So let's say designer made 3 different options of the homepage, and manager chooses one they like most. They may rely on a gut feeling to make that decision, but design is not an art. We can measure everything, and we can make that decision basing on data saying which out of these 3 designs perform best. And that's what the next area of design actions relates to. It's really more than a feeling. We need analytical leadership. Design is really measurable, more than many of us may think. It's also up to designers to change that current mindset and bring design decisions to executives or even C-level people and show how these decisions tie into business goals. And now I would like to tell you about our design process, which was obviously user-centered, and we've been relying on this at Tuesday for a couple of years now. It's really generic, I think, and can be applied to most contexts. Simple phases: research, generate insight, concept creation, design, and then monitoring. Obviously, there's a development between designing and monitoring how the product performs if it's a mobile app, for example. So let's focus on each of those. First, we have research. And research, although it's very common at the beginning of many projects, it shouldn't happen just once. Research is useful for any new product, any new feature of that product, useful as a response to a market change or behavior change of our audiences. At Tuesday, I divided our research into three areas, three categories. We had business research, market research, and target audience research. And each category informs the others, so they are not really that separate. And that's where design workshops come very handy. For example, like I did at Tuesday, I sit down with the financial controller, with our CEO, and we defined success metrics. Because when you build a product or service, you want to be able to measure that you are successful. You need KPIs, key performance indicators, to track, and what are the ideal numbers for you to reach. But design workshops are also good for revealing some hidden knowledge. There's lots of hidden knowledge, and usually as designers, the requirements we receive from our clients usually are very, very brief, and usually they're not enough for us. That's why we design lots of workshops and exercises, questions to reveal what is it that our client really wants us to design. I quite successfully used Lean Canvas workshops, where you ask maybe more business-oriented questions, but user experience designers need to know business objectives very well, and very often they might actually help in defining those objectives by having good understanding of the market and users. At Tuesday, we also did design the box exercise, which helps to create some foundation for future marketing communication, but also refine the one you have already, and perhaps see that people talk and think different about product internally and externally. That's quite bad, I would say. It's important to have the shared vocabulary and openness outside and inside, because user experience of our users, it's hugely dependent on our own user experience in our own companies. To be honest, what users experience is just an extension of what happens within the business. But coming back to research, I mentioned business research. Now let's move on to market research. So here you ideally want to identify key players on the market in your niche, who is on the rise, who is worth paying attention to in the next few years. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What opportunities lie in this for you? Finally, market research also means researching your audience, and might be about finding out from your competitors who your audience might be, right? By finding lookalikes. It's also worth to spend some time defining your inspirators. Who are the companies you feel inspired by, and what can we learn from them? In my personal experience, it's usually Apple. I hear that all the CEOs I work with admire Apple and the sleek designs, or at least the feel they designs trigger. And that's usually quite a good guidance for me as a designer to know what to create. And then we have users, our audience. This doesn't have to be an expensive research, because there's lots of research and results and insights publicly available. At Tuesday specifically, we referred to research done by Bax, which was looking at how people manage, use, or perceive direct debits. That was very, very revealing and thorough research, which I think was 100 pages long, and it was available for free online. So there's lots of researches of this kind for any industry, I believe. You don't have to spend lots of money on making your own, unless what you make, your product is really, really specific. So there's lots of surveys you could do, lots of tests. If the product already exists, you can measure its performance on the technical side, let's say loading speeds, but also invite people, give them tasks, and the tasks should be the main things people usually do with that product, and observe how they try to get there and see what obstacles they experience on the way, so that you can come up with ideas as a designer how to remove them. So this is all about quantitative data, right? When we look at numbers. However, it's important to also develop a good feel for our users and just talk to them. And it doesn't have to be a user, it doesn't have to be a laboratory condition. You can just talk to people outside in the world during networking events and share your ideas for the product and see how people respond to it and what they add to it. Look for individual stories. Here are some photos from Tuesday. That's the workshop I mentioned at the beginning. We have financial controller, we have a machine learning expert, we have a senior and junior developer, we have both co-founders, and myself, the very first designer. We went outside, we did surveys with people, we learned what are the pain points in our context, payments and direct debits. And we also found lots of great research online. Here's a screenshot from the Bax research I mentioned. Very revealing. Next stage is obviously insights, because once you collect data, you have to process them, extract, prioritize them, and produce some insights that can inform the next stages of your design process. And at this point, you can again use design workshops. For example, to create affinity maps. They can be used for sorting information. I think I used affinity maps for designing a homepage. So I wanted to know how other people in the team think what's important for our users. Because, to be honest, when we really started, we didn't have much data about users themselves. So we made certain assumptions. Later, we developed a survey and we asked actual people certain things. And when we got 100 responses, we started grouping those responses into different categories to reveal different user archetypes, which we called user personas, which is also quite a significant design artifact that helps designers a lot in marketing people and sales people, from my experience too. But it's okay if you don't have that data to start with, you don't really have budget to do. So you can, to start with, just assume who your users are, although it's not really a tidy way of doing it. And then when you come up with features or maybe ideas for the homepage, what kind of building blocks should be there, just prioritize them. For example, on the homepage, if you offer some service, it's great to have testimonials, trust indicators, case studies. Obviously, if you're a new business, you don't have those yet. Just try to have them as soon as possible through some maybe pilot programs, but it's okay if you don't have them yet, and they might be done later. User personas are quite useful as well. They're actually a software requirement written from an end user perspective. So developers are very used to working with them, but they're also super handy for designers. They have a specific format. For example, as Paula, I want to organize my work so I can feel more in control. There are other essential design artifacts too. We have user journeys, empathy maps, storyboards. This really help create a good feel for the user, to know who they really are, what their experience is. And one product can have different personas, right? Different user types. And so if we create a user journey for each, if we create empathy mat for each, we can treat them as HUDs. And when we design something, and we obviously as people tend to design for ourselves because that's our nature to project ourselves onto others, when we wear those hats, we can be able to see what we design from the point of view of that particular user type, which is really, really handy. Here we have a photo of our CTO taking part in a persona workshop. And here are our personas, which are obviously not real people. They are fictional characters. Next, we have concept. So the time comes for the project to sketch, test, validate, and iterate the idea we are having. It's great to use this stage to simulate the user flow for testing, for example. So at this point, we can have a prototype, let's say interactive wireframes. At Tuesday, we built the first digital wireframes we built with Azure, which is really cool software, although a bit old at this point, but still very, very handy because it allows you to use variables. So users in the test can actually provide some information in the forms, and then they can the prototype can store this data they provided and show them on the screen later in the journey. So it really very quickly allows to test how the product will work and whether the concept really makes sense. And this stage really, really provides lots of feedback and further feeds the further iterations of design. And design is actually the next stage where we go more into detail. Here's a photo of me and Josh, our designer, reviewing wireframes for our website and whether they correspond with the user flow. A very first paper prototypes for the Tuesday app. Okay, so the design is next, and that's a really great moment to test even in more detail and package that design. So when we proved and improved the concept, we can start refining the finest detail. And it's quite interesting how many questions come up in this phase. Because obviously the more you go into detail, the more you have to think about areas you maybe didn't think earlier as a designer. And there's lots of going back and forth with developers all the time. You know, this design process is not separate from them. They are really involved all the time. So at this point, we create high fidelity clickable prototypes. Shouldn't be identical with the final product. Usually there is no need for that. But just to test the key journeys, really. We can produce style guides, mostly for developers to know how to build what we designed, so that this time spent on counting pixels doesn't get lost. But also for future designers, you know, it might be someone else, if it's a great, big company, big teams, someone else might be designing this in the future, so it would be great to provide some guidelines for them as well. And any additional specification. So here we have photos of our nice website, which was being created along the app to promote it. We have a picture of me in a usability test where we actually were testing the app that was being built at this point. So developers built a very version of the app, alpha, and it covered only very basic journeys, and we were testing the concept again, but also the app itself. As I said, in this stage we create additional documentation. So for example, spreadsheets with lots of information that again will be very helpful for developers. This one specifies what notifications the app sends what the content for those notifications, and what channels are being used to send them, whether it's email, a text message, maybe a letter if it comes to verifying someone's address, and then which notifications are just in-app notifications and which ones show as push notifications. And then perhaps some exceptions. If the user didn't give us permission to show a push notification on the screen, we can instead show an email with the same content. And as I said, implementation is already happening in the background. User experience designers and other designers should be involved in testing the quality of what's being built. And finally, when the product is being built, or one of its versions, time comes for monitoring the behavior of users. And this is a really great moment, and designers have to be really brave here to capture lots of quantitative data, tracking KPIs, seeing how people use what we designed, whether our assumptions are right. Hopefully we already answered those questions throughout our user-centered design process, but there might be still certain things we didn't predict. It's very important to be open-minded at this stage and not to be attached to designs and defensive about them, because the real validation really waits outside. Here I have a heat map of our website. I found this one quite interesting. So this heat map shows how people click on the website. And for some reason, they were clicking a lot on the heading called Safe and Secure. At first I was really surprised why they do that, and I actually went and checked if it's a link or just a static heading, and actually it is just text. So they were clicking on it because they wanted to find out more. So basing on that, we created a dedicated page where we talk about safety and security of our payment app. So that was a little bit from the life of a user experience designer. I hope you benefited from it, whether you're a designer yourself or you're thinking about hiring one, or there's already someone working in your company as a user experience designer, and now you have a little bit of insight into how you could further support their work and how it actually ties into business goals and your financial performance. Thank you so much for your time.